I think it's fair to say that tank is the most important role in Overwatch 2 right now. They have so much impact over the game, have a ton of solo carry potential, and in the right hands look downright overpowered. But since heroes in Overwatch are so diverse and unique, it can be pretty hard to figure out how exactly to find the most value on any given tank pick. So to make this as easy as possible, we're going to take every single tank in the game and separate them into one of three categories based on what their biggest strengths are, what types of heroes they synergize with, and of course how to best play them or play against them. So even though we won't be going in depth about every single tank in this video, that would take way too long, you should be able to use these categories to figure out what jobs you're supposed to be doing as these different tank heroes. If you're in the market for more in-depth knowledge or more character-specific tips, then you should head over to GameLeap.com. We can't cover every single detail in a short YouTube video like this one. That's why over on the website, we've got hundreds of guides made by top-level coaches with more being added every single week that'll cover everything you want to know about the game. So no matter what your skill level is or what heroes you happen to main, GameLeap has something that can help you improve and rank up quickly. So check out the links below to get your membership started today. Alright, let's start things off simple with our first category of tanks, the anchors. These are the classic embodiment of tankiness that everyone expects from the role. These are your tanks like Orisa, Ramattra, Reinhardt, and Sigma. And remember, of course, these tanks play very differently. You're not going to position or play the same way as Orisa as you would on Sigma. These are very different tanks, but they still fulfill similar roles or jobs in game. So that's what we're focusing on today. Anchor tanks' biggest strengths are, of course, their defensive resources. They usually have high HP pools, armor, shields, and strong defensive cooldowns to keep them up during a fight, as well as their threatening close range damage. These things alone make them incredibly durable, or just tanky in other words, and make them an absolute bully whenever it comes to fights in the front line. These types of tanks are typically best paired with high output supports and consistent damage dealers. So you'll look to pair with supports like Ana, Baptiste, or Moira, who can allow these tanks to go aggressive thanks to their high healing output instead of needing to hold up their shields constantly or back up after their first cooldown. I'll add a note here and just say that these tanks also synergize well with Lucio. Despite his low healing output, the speed that he provides is so good for these heroes since they lack other types of mobility, and they'll want that speed to be more threatening or to be safer when they're backing up. And for DPS again, we're looking for consistency. Whoever you know you can depend on to dish out a strong amount of damage once you get the fight going. So we can look at long-range hit-scan characters like Cassidy or Soldier 76, or maybe something closer range like Junkrat or Reaper. You'll synergize well with these types of DPS because of how long you can last during a team fight. All that durability and hopefully some of that healing coming in from the support line means you'll be buying time for these DPS to be free firing into their targets. Just keep in mind that in order to buy that time for them, you need to be aggressive. You need to be running in and trying to AoE taunt the enemy team into shooting you so that you're absorbing all that damage instead of your teammates. So going into how you want to play these types of tanks, what you're going to want to do most of the time is get into close range against your biggest threats. Not only to threaten them with your close range damage, but to make sure that any of your defensive resources, your shields, your cooldowns are absorbing their pressure directly. This sometimes looks like trying to diff the enemy tank and pushing through the front line, but more often than not, you're actually looking for enemy DPS here. You want to deny them value more than anyone else. So if they're up on the high grounds, take the time to move around the map and push them out of the way. And while you're working to get into close range, you're looking for two situations to use your biggest resources, whether that's your shield or big cooldowns. You can use these things to break into a new area of the map, like going through a choke point or rounding a corner. This allows more space for your team to work and hopefully get some of that consistent damage going. Or defensively, you're going to be using these same things to just keep yourself alive for as long as possible, because again, you're just buying time for your team where the enemy isn't shooting at them, they're shooting at you. So as long as you can stay alive during those moments, you'll be doing well. Just keep in mind that while anchors are some of the tankiest tanks in the game, you'll still need to be giving up space when you're out of cooldowns or when the enemy's using ultimates and things like that. You can't just sit in one spot forever, even though you can technically do that better than any other type of tank. And if you find yourself going up against an anchor tank on the enemy team, there's typically one of two things you can try to do to make that matchup easier for you. Your first option is to stack a ton of damage in the front line and just burn through all those defensive resources before they can find any value. Use characters like Bastion or Junkrat to bully them and make sure they can't play the game. And your second option is to just play keep away with the enemy tank. Use all the areas of the map that they have trouble contesting. I'm talking about high grounds and flank routes, for example. example. When playing this way, keep in mind that as soon as you see where the enemy anchor tank is, you also know where they aren't. They lack mobility to flexibly change their position, so as soon as you know where they are, just stay away from them. Alright, moving on, our next category of tanks, a very popular archetype this season especially, are the dive tanks, and we're looking at Doomfist, Winston, and Wrecking Ball. And their biggest strength is right in the name, they can dive. They've got a ton of mobility that's centered around very high value cooldowns. This allows them to play very unique space and threaten unique sight lines and high grounds that other types of tanks can't do as easily. When building a composition around a dive tank, you're typically looking for opportunities for burst damage, as well as if you're playing any long-range backliners, you want to make sure you can be independently safe since these tanks won't be offering you much when you get pushed yourself. So for supports, you might be looking for someone with high mobility like Lucio or Kiriko who can keep themselves safe during a dive attempt, or maybe a long-range support like Ana or Zenyatta who, of course, can keep themselves safe at range, hopefully, but also offer burst damage opportunities with Discord orbs or anti-grenades. And we'll be looking for the same things in the DPS line. Independent and high mobility characters like Tracer or Genji can keep themselves safe as well as follow up your dive opportunities, or you can look for long range characters who also have burst damage in their kits, so maybe some snipers like Widowmaker, Hanzo, or Sojourn could synergize well. The keys here are that you're looking for very strict burst opportunities whenever you're playing a dive tank. You don't want to extend a team fight for too long if you haven't already found a kill. And these opportunities are largely dependent on all the cooldowns you'll be using as a dive tank. You'll want to adopt a sort of hit and run style of game plan when playing a dive tank. You want to get in with all your cooldowns, find as much value as you can, but if you haven't gotten a huge advantage like a kill, then you'll need to back off, wait for those cooldowns to come back, and then try again later. This means for the most part, you'll be looking for soft dives and then only securing kills with a strong advantage. What I mean by soft dive is basically anytime you're going aggressive, you also have an escape route in mind. But just because these types of dives won't always find a kill doesn't mean that they're low value. You need to use soft dives in order to find success for your team. So don't get bloodthirsty and chase down every kill you see, but try to use your cooldowns to force people out of power positions, get them out of important sight lines, or push them off of a high ground. When you do have opportunities to finish kills as a dive tank, it's usually because of a pretty obvious advantage. Maybe it's because you've isolated someone completely away from their team, or you're using an ultimate. Whatever the case is, it's a clear advantage that you have over your enemy, and it shouldn't be any more risky than going for those soft dives. If you find yourself struggling against an enemy dive tank, just keep in mind that you want to either fight them before or after they're engaged, but not during their dive attempt. This means that if you can poke out an enemy dive tank before they're able to set up for their engage, so that you can maybe force them to play more defensively and not get a dive off at all. But if they do manage to get on top of you, make sure that you respect them. Their cooldowns are very strong and we don't want to get isolated or picked off before we can even react. But then if we do manage to survive that situation by giving up some space or using some defensive cooldowns, then we can very easily push back into that dive tank. They are much weaker after they've used important cooldown. So once Winston's jump or Doomfist punch is out of the way, we can go right back to bullying them since they'll be much weaker without those important cooldowns ready to go. And another thing I should mention is that dive tanks hate crowd control. So characters like Orisa with her javelin, Sombra with her hack, or even Ana with her sleep dart are great countering tools because you can shut down a dive as it's happening with these abilities. Just keep in mind that when you're playing against these types of tanks, you're just trying to avoid those 1 to 2 seconds where they are finding their most value at the peak of their dive. As long as we can avoid that, we'll be fine. Our third category of tanks is the hardest one to define out of all of them. And these are just what I'm going to call specialists. We're looking at Diva, Junker Queen, Roadhog, and Zarya. And to address the elephant in the room here, yes, I'm calling Diva a specialist, not a dive tank. I know she has mobility, I know she's got more mobility than the likes of Doomfist or Winston, but that still doesn't make her a dive tank. If you've played Diva, you know you can't just hit your boosters and go into a team fight and really expect anything to happen. You want to play more defensively and more reactively, which in my mind makes her more of a specialist. Like I mentioned, this category is pretty hard to define as a whole since the strengths of each of these heroes don't necessarily overlap with one another, but they typically play into either high damage output or flexible utility. Or both if we're talking about Zarya. Whatever the case though, I think all of these tanks synergize with the same types of heroes, and that's going to be independent players on both the DPS and support role. So we're going to be looking at characters with either high mobility to keep themselves safe, or really long ranges so that they can play independently without needing a tank in front of them. That covers a pretty wide array of the entire Overwatch cast, so basically all you're trying to avoid here are characters that demand a frontline. So you don't want to play DPS like Mei or Symmetra, and you probably don't want to play support like Brigitte. The reasoning for this is pretty straightforward. These tanks don't really function the same way as other tanks in the game, in the same way that they create space or block damage. These tanks actually function a lot more like DPS than they do other tanks. This means that we're not going to depend on these types of tanks to hold down an angle for a long amount of time or break us into a new area of the map that we can rush into behind them, but instead we're going to treat them more as independent playmakers. So the first thing you should remember if you're playing these types of tanks is that you do not belong in the front line. You don't want to go toe-to-toe with an anchor tank. They will outlast you and outdamage you in a lot of situations, and while you do have good matchups against dive tanks, if you run straight forward into them, they're just going to jump past you and ignore you. So instead, you'll want to turn your attention to as many off angles as you can. This can look like flank routes or high grounds most commonly. The way that these tanks will typically control space will either be by giving their utility to a teammate when controlling an off angle, say like with D.Va's Matrix or Zarya's Bubbles, or by being a unique threat themselves that pulls the enemy's attention away from their front line, splitting them up and forcing them to look in different directions. If you can hit a flank at just the right time as Roadhog or Junker Queen, then you can threaten high priority members and split up their attention. This will force the enemy team to react to you, maybe burn some cooldowns, maybe back up, and this should afford more space for your team in the front line to get into the teamfight. Whatever the case or whatever plays you're looking for in game, just keep in mind these tanks need to operate independently. They shouldn't be too reliant on DPS to finish their kills or supports to keep them up during a fight. This independent nature can make them some of the most influential tanks in the game and some of the best for trying to solo carry a match, but it also means that if you're getting countered, these are the first tanks you're going to want to swap off of. And speaking of countering them, if you're playing against one of these specialists, your best bet to countering them is actually trying to ignore them. By putting heavy pressure into their teammates, and ideally multiple of their teammates at the same time, they won't be able to react defensively the same way that an anchor tank would, and they're not going to be able to create as many opportunities the same way as a dive tank would. The key here is to make sure you're playing around their utilities, so stuff like defense matrix and bubbles, while also staying at a strong range to keep away from hooks, Junker Queen damage, or even high charge Zarya damage. The good news when countering these heroes is that the moment they show their hand, similar to a dive tank when they use their cooldowns or an anchor tank when they show their position, whenever they use their important resources and they don't find value, these are some of the easiest tanks to bully out of the way because, again, they're not really tanks. They're closer to DPS in a lot of ways. So whatever tanks you find yourself playing, or maybe playing against this season, I hope this video helps you better understand your matchups and gives you a clear game plan going into your matches. Like I mentioned, we didn't have the time to go super in depth on every single tank pick, so let us know down in the comments, who's your tank main this season and what are their biggest strengths in your eyes? How do you like to play them? Personally, I'm enjoying playing Wrecking Ball again in competitive and just rolling around the map like a demon. But in any case, that's it for me today, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you in the next one. So if you're looking for more information about your main in particular, don't forget to go check out GameLeap.com. Over there, you can use our hundreds of guides made by top-level coaches to help you improve at any aspect of the game. So whether you're a beginner or you're trying to push to a new peak this season, you'll find something that can help you climb. So head on over to GameLeap.com and get your membership started today. That's going to be all for me today, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.